Over the past decade, there's been a big shift in the way people eat food. And a big part of this movement has been towards a vegan or plant-based lifestyle, which simply means not consuming products that contain or are derived from animals. This obviously means no meat or chicken, but it also means no eggs and no cheese. That's right. Can you imagine a world without cheese? For many exploring a plant-based lifestyle, taking cheese out of their diet seems impossible, which is why today's guest is so timely. Lauren, who I attended undergraduate with, is the founder of LOCA. LOCA produces a plant-based queso that's not only better for the planet and animals, but a healthier alternative to the more traditional dairy-based cheese sauces. In this episode, Lauren shares with us how she's gone from making queso in her own kitchen to selling the product online across the US. I'm Jarrett Carpenter, and this is Wi-Fi Water. Lauren, welcome to Wi-Fi and Water. How you doing?
Thank you so much. I'm doing great. So excited to be on your podcast. Thank you so much for having me.
For all the listeners who are listening, Lauren and I are lynxes. What's the plural? Lynxy?
Ooh,
lynxes?
Good question. Yeah, let's go with that. Know. I don't know either.
It ends in an X. Well, somebody will.
We should have learned that at Rhodes.
Yeah. Can you imagine?
Us. Yeah.
But we went to college together down at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And Lauren is on because she's going to talk to us today about LOCA food, which I love as a person who speaks Spanish. So let's actually start there. How did you choose that name?
You know, it's funny. The name ended up resonating with me for kind of a variety of reasons, multiple angles. The English word LOCA is plural of the word locus, which means central source of power, gathering place, meeting place, kind of a central locality. And I love that personally because I grew up in the American South. And if you've been in, Arkansas, Texas, Tennessee, as well, where we went to school, cheese dip or queso is, it's on the menu everywhere, every restaurant. It's, a very, very popular food in the South. And for me growing up, cheese dip was always on the table. Any kind of gathering, whether it was a birthday party, graduation, you name it, there's going to be cheese dip there. And so that resonated with me in the literal sense that it is sort of this food dish that brings people together. Beyond that, the word locavore was actually coined by two women in California. And that means to try to eat as much local food as possible to reduce your carbon footprint. And I loved that word, but it was already trademarked. And I liked it because I knew starting out that I wanted to try my hardest to source all the ingredients from the US, try to source the ingredients as close as possible to my manufacturer to reduce, shipping, freight, and reduce my carbon footprint as well. So I loved it from that angle. And then, of course, as you mentioned, LOCA in Spanish is the feminine, form of the word crazy. And, I knew at the time that depending on where you were from or what language you spoke, the definition for you would have different meanings. And I kind of love that too. And I was like, well, if people interpret it that way, it also, arguably applies. This is a crazy thing that I decided to do. Solo female founder, left my career behind to do this.
Yeah, because I said that thinking that I'd hit it on the head. I'm like, oh, live in La Vida Loca. Everyone knows what that word means because Ricky Martin, if you didn't know before that, you knew after.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm like, oh, obviously she was trying to, selfishly, I'm like, oh, Lauren's so ahead of the game. She's trying to channel, really corner the vegan Hispanic market, right? And really be the cornerstone for all the cheese dip. But it's good to know that there are two other kind of, it's a triangle of definitions, the way that you've kind of positioned the name. And she started 2 years ago. Is that the story? And how did you start?
These are running together. So I started the business officially, I think it was sometime in 2018. COVID has caused, all days to run together. And it's crazy when you're asking me how I started. Believe it or not, in school, I studied art and I was on track to build a career as a designer. I spent the first 10 years working as a designer. I started on print and then I moved to brand. And then when I moved out to San Francisco about 8 years ago, got bit by the tech bug and worked for early stage startups and moved over to the product and engineering side of design. And I loved my career. Honestly, I never thought I would leave it. I loved everything about it. But similar, I think, to you, as I got older, I started becoming almost like obsessed and really fascinated with everything about sustainability, food, really just thinking about how the food we put in our bodies has such a direct impact on our health, on animal welfare, and on the environment. And started just separately outside of my job, trying to do a deep dive into these things. And like I mentioned, personally growing up eating cheese dip and eating a ton of meat and dairy. I ate meat and dairy at every single meal growing up, and I ate a lot of processed foods. And so when I started making this connection and realizing that, the food we eat really has this enormous impact beyond ourselves, I started just separately spending my time educating, myself on everything I could learn about this subject. Long story short, I ended up switching to a pescatarian diet, eventually vegetarian, and it took me years to give up processed cheese sauce. That was the last thing to go for me. And when I finally eliminated that food, I, was kind of initially nervous to tell my friends and family back home that I was plant-based or vegan, which is very much like a dirty word where I'm from. And I was really surprised that the response was overwhelmingly positive. And I was asked constantly, what types of foods can I start eating? I want to try Meatless Monday. Very much a positive reaction. But there was kind of this common theme that kept coming up. And I kept hearing from people that dairy, cheese specifically, was something that they sort of vowed to never give up. They thought they could do the meat, but not the dairy. And cheese, as we know, is inherently addicting by design. It's for baby cows. It's supposed to get a baby cow, hooked on milk for nutrients. And so it makes sense that this cheese is like so delicious and addicting to us as humans. And so I started just doing a deep dive into the market and quickly noticed that the majority of the dairy alternatives on the market, this was about 2 years ago at the time, were primarily made from cashews and almonds. And as you probably know, cashews and almonds require large amounts of water to grow. Most almonds actually are coming from California, and we are very much in the middle of a decades-long drought. So, I knew from a sustainability angle that while nuts are a better alternative from a sustainability standpoint to dairy cheese, I was concerned that they weren't really going to get us there in the long term. And so I wanted to explore alternative bases for dairy products that required less water, ideally were allergen free, and that were more sort of like universally acceptable to most palates, so to speak. And started just experimenting at home on the weekends. I would work 9 to 5 and I'd come home and start making a mess in my kitchen. Didn't really know what I was doing at first. And then I landed on something that I thought, okay, this is pretty good. And it was made with potatoes. And I was sharing this with a friend of mine who had also left her tech career to start a food company. And she said, you need to pitch that to somebody. So I was like, okay, I'll do this. I took it to a local commercial kitchen, shared with them what I had created, and their response was really, really positive. And they encouraged me to join their kitchen space and really just get in there and try to start learning the ins and outs of the food industry. So that was a very long-winded story, but that's how I officially, kind of got started in this world about 2 years ago.
It's so crazy that we haven't spoken in many years, admittedly, because that's what happens after college,
Yeah.
So we haven't talked in many years, more than a decade, if we're being honest, yet we've had very similar life trajectories as far as the way that we approach our professional and personal careers, and how those careers are constantly intertwined with bigger questions about sustainability, our carbon footprint, and really, are we doing the best things not only for ourselves, but for the planet and the other people who are part of the planet? Because as you start to delve into it, and as I told you before we started recording, I'm going on 4 years of being a pescatarian. And admittedly, during that time, I've had meat I'm going to have meat, I think in the next couple of months, because my friend Sean, he's like, I make the best burger ever, but you can't try it. And I'm like, well, come on. All right, well, I'll try it. So we're going to we're setting ourselves up. Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of my transition into this diet is threefold. One of them is for me personally. I know that I've grown up in the United States eating processed food for a long time. So when I was basically 30, I made the choice, hey, I want to get away from that. I really want to have control over what's going into my body. So me personally, on a personal level. The second one is for the animals. I think we have to have a real conversation about how we all have pets, yet we all eat
Absolutely.
animals.
Yeah.
And the animals that we eat feel the same pain that our pets feel. And I know for a fact that there are so many people who are going to listen to this podcast who would much rather hang out with animals for the rest of their life than people. Yeah, exactly.
Raising my
Lauren
hand.
raised her hand. You guys can't see that, but Lauren raised her hand. And then the third thing was just for the planet, because as you said, we know certain foods that we eat, and you mentioned almonds and cashews, but we go farther and we know that, 70% of the grain that we farm in this country is then to go into animals that we fatten up and then we kill. So that is cool that we've both been on this same trajectory.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And how has the transformation been outside of your business on a personal level? Maybe breaking down some stereotypes and then bringing it into that's a personal, and then on a professional level, are you breaking into the South, or are you just on the coasts, or is it just big in Manhattan and San Francisco?
I grew up in Arkansas. I grew up in Little Rock specifically. And funny, additional side note about the naming. With my MVP product that I'll tell you about this later, soft launched in a test market, I actually called it cheese dip. And I quickly learned that doesn't really resonate with people outside of Arkansas specifically. Queso does. So that's another reason for the name change. But I grew up, in Arkansas, as you asked. And, my personal experience growing up has very much shaped, I think, the long-term mission for my company. My mom and my stepdad live in a town now that we would refer to as a food desert. So, there isn't a Whole Foods, there isn't these, sort of premium, I think you mentioned this before we started recording, but you have like a favorite, maybe like a co-op or a store that you love going to. This doesn't exist in the town that my parents live in now. There's a Walmart and there's convenience stores. I think they recently got a pretty good local grocery store. But for the most part, the people around the town, they have to drive in a long way to come to Walmart. And so their options are very limited. And I'm very much aware of sort of the reality for most Americans, especially now with COVID, that's been amplified. Unfortunately, so many people have lost their jobs. There's an enormous amount of people living off of minimum wage, and they don't have access to the abundance of fresh food and the variety of food that, for example, I am so fortunate to have the luxury of having access to living in, the Bay Area. And so I very much recognize that is a problem. And I think there's some interesting things that are really happening, I think, in the plant-based movement, especially if you look at the data, but also for me, just personally, I can see this happening. There has been sort of this, I think, more positive adoption of plant-based eating. And I would argue that's been accelerated with COVID, strangely enough. There's been this sort of shift in interest, and people are eating at home. They're interested in eating more whole foods. They want to eat more plant-based foods. That's really happened. But at the same time, there's also this, extreme like rocket ship growth in comfort foods too. So it's like kind of strange to see these two things happening. And I think in Arkansas and in the South, people are much more open to, shifting their diet, trying out a meatless Monday than they were 10 years ago. But it's still, I can't tell you that it's anywhere near the same experience that I have in San Francisco. You can easily go to an all plant-based restaurant in this area, or no problem finding vegan options on the menu. But that's certainly not the case when I go home, to my hometown. And it is hard when you go to restaurants that are chains and your options are limited, especially if you're really trying to eat more plant-based. I can share this story with you. When I was home last, we went to a Cracker Barrel. I hadn't been to a Cracker Barrel in a decade. I loved it growing up. And I ordered a vegetable platter. And I think on the vegetables, they had listed like green beans, maybe turnip greens, and then potatoes or baked potato. So I didn't think anything of it and just ordered it off the menu. Kid you not, I think the turnip greens had bits of bacon in it, and the green beans had like some sort of like ham slices, and the potatoes, were doused in like bacon, butter, and some sort of cream. And I just remember thinking like, wow, I forgot like how hard. It is. Even when you think you're ordering a vegetable off of like, the menu, there's probably going to be meat and dairy, on that food. So it is hard. And then beyond that, I think there's a lack of education. People struggle with, how do I eat more plant-based foods? I don't understand. How do I make them taste good? And this might be veering off onto a separate conversation, but there's the kind of emergence of these premium vegan goods. We've got the Impossible Burger, Beyond, my product right now, which is more of a premium price point. And then you have the opposite end of the spectrum, which is, just eating everyday vegan staples, which is beans and rice and tofu and these really, really cheap goods. I would argue you can eat whole foods cheaply, but it's not something that's quick and easy to do. You really have to think about rewiring your brain, rethinking your plate, but it is possible. So I know I'm going off on a tangent on another topic, but I do think you've hit on something really interesting.
I think it's a really valid point, and I don't think it's actually veering off at all. In the intersectional world that we live in, you really can't talk about the food deserts and what you're talking about with then also talking about the economics behind it and how you do have premium products like Beyond Meat, like Impossible, like your product. And then you also can just say, hey, if you focus on grains and legumes, you're also good. And the tofu, I have tofu multiple times a week, and tofu actually I struggle with because it comes in this little plastic carton, which I absolutely hate. It is recyclable, but I'm really just trying to be zero waste whenever possible. But it's so cheap for the amount of kickback it gets.
Oh yeah.
It cost me about like maybe $1.99. Yeah. And the amount of protein that it has for that and the fill it gives me, I mean, it's like a steak. But like you said, this is one of the biggest things, and I think it's one of the reasons why more people aren't more plant-based. It just takes time. It takes so much time. It's methodical. Before, I was vegan for about 6 months many years ago, and the only difference I can honestly tell people between being vegan and being not is I just had to think about what I was going to eat. Whenever I went out with people, I had to kind of look at the menu before and see if I could eat something, or maybe I'd prepare food and then I'd go sit at the restaurant and just get water or, a drink, because otherwise you're going to be stuck with the classic vegan meme, which is like, I'll have the fries, right? Because that's it. Yeah. And so I totally think it is completely intersectional, and you can't really talk about, I'm glad that we were able to talk about the food deserts and the premium products. And now shifting into your product long-term, what are your plans to try as best you can being a premium product to make it more equitable and its access to people who maybe can't afford Queso as it is now?
I think the best way for me to actually answer the looking forward question is to look back just a little bit pre-COVID. So when I started the company, I mentioned, I'd started out in a commercial kitchen, and I started out by setting up this test market in Northern California. I got really fortunate. I got the product in Oracle Park Baseball Stadium, had the team there bring in the product into the park and test it with Impossible Foods chili. And from there, it sort of by word of mouth started spreading, and I got the product into University of San Francisco and some corporate tech campuses like Airbnb and NVIDIA, a couple of restaurants, and also tested in some grocery stores. And that was great because, being kind of a product person, I wanted to see the data and understand how I could improve the formula, the application, how chefs were going to use it, how consumers were going to respond, really just learn as much as I could before investing in scaling. And the test market went really well, and it was working beautifully in food service. And originally I planned to launch entirely into food service last spring. I was planning on expanding into more ballparks and movie theaters, concert venues, which is sort of funny to look back on now. Obviously, COVID had different plans. And with that original game plan, what I love about food service for this product is it allows me to access a mainstream market really, really quickly. It pushes big volumes, but what's interesting about trying a product out in the context of like a ballpark and a restaurant first, which is definitely pulling from the Impossible Foods playbook, is I would argue that let's say I've got somebody, let's use one of my friends back in Arkansas. If they're going grocery shopping, most consumers have a fixed grocery list. They buy the same products all the time. It's difficult to get consumers to shift their purchasing habits. And so the argument is, if you're not already eating plant-based, you're not likely going to go into the vegan section or try a vegan product, out of nowhere at the grocery store. But if you are, say you're going to a movie or you're going to a baseball game, you see the product in front of you, someone's eating it next to you, it looks good. And you hear someone say, hey, they have this option available and it's cholesterol free, or, allergen free, whatever the appeal is to you. It's a little bit more nutritious. Why don't you try it? It's a fun context. My thinking is you're more likely to try the product in that context. So food service was the original game plan. I was so excited to roll out in that regard and had to shift gears a bit. And so now that I found myself going into e-commerce to start, there's a ton of silver linings to, I think, starting with this channel. But the byproduct of e-commerce is the unit economics are a lot more dense. There's a lot of layers involved that you don't see that same amount of margin hit that you do in food service. So with e-commerce, you're dealing with freight, logistics costs, you're dealing with kitting fees, fulfillment fees, Shopify's fees. The fees are endless. And you're also dealing with shipping. And shipping costs a lot to small businesses. You save a little bit, but it's nowhere near Amazon, who has a monopoly on the ability to offer free shipping. And so there are a lot of fees associated with that, which is why you see oftentimes these direct-to-consumer brands, their price point is higher. And most of the time, if you're starting out in e-commerce, you'll see that price point drop when these products hit brick and mortar retail, just by nature of the distribution model and your unit economics. So yes, my plan is very much so when we go into brick and mortar, likely 2022, that the price point will drop down just naturally. And I do hope to go into more mainstream retailers so that I can reach these people. We're not going to be able to be price competitive with dairy for a little while, but my hope is that eventually we will be. I want to be close to the Tostitos cheese dip in price, so that if you're normally going to pay $4 for Tostitos and our product is, let's say it's $5 or $6, spending those $1 or $2 extra dollars is worth it to you because of the value props, and it's not spending $10 extra. So that's definitely the plan. In terms of giving back, yes, absolutely. I do hope to eventually set up, a 1% back program. I'm actually looking into that right now. I'm really interested in helping young kids eat healthier. I'd like to partner with school systems. I mean, there's just an endless list of kind of areas or segments that I would like to give back and explore. Like you said, animal welfare to me is something I deeply, deeply care about personally. You won't see that on my brand, though. I really want my brand to be fun and with a focus to be on like taste and delicious food. But personally, behind the scenes, I care deeply about that. And then, of course, sustainability and helping to combat climate change as well is a priority.
I often think about growing up in the world we grew up in. We grew up in the world of DARE, which was like, don't do drugs, right? If you do drugs, you're going to die.
Yeah. Yep.
And that was because in the 80s, right around before we came into the world, there was the Joe Camel who was making smoking really cool to kids.
Yes.
Right. So I'm thinking that moving forward, more brands are going to kind of do what you've done, which is like make not vegan, but plant-based, because that for some reason is a lot more digestible for the grand populace, but make plant-based cool.
Yeah.
And I've liked what Beyond Meat has done. I knew Beyond Meat was going to do well when they were linking up with guys like Chris Paul and Kyrie Irving, and they had them on their brand ambassador team. And that Chris Paul hasn't, if you haven't seen it, go to YouTube and type in Chris Paul Beyond Meat. It's about a minute long. And he basically talks about how, he's shooting with his son, shooting some hoops with his son. And he's talking about how he wants to eat this way because it's better for him. It's better for his son. It's better for the planet. It's better for everyone's future. They don't say plant-based. They don't say vegan. They have these close-ups of all the plant-based products, which I don't even know if they were actual the products, right? But the idea is they did it in such a cool way to make this Beyond Meat thing seem really cool. And I think that's the way the plant-based will continue to gain in the food services market.
Absolutely.
Have you thought about linking with someone really cool? And who, if you could have two athletes, maybe pick a male and a female, who would you want repping LOCA and why?
Actually, question for you.
Yes.
Did you see the Game Changers movie on Netflix by chance?
I saw it the second it came out.
Okay, you saw it. So I loved it. And I love following like plant-based athletes on Instagram. And, it's just incredible to see these people truly like debunking the myth of that vegan somehow equals like not being strong. So I love that. And it's been so cool to see the athletic community like embrace, plant-based eating. And you see it with basketball and football. You really see it too, even in racing, NASCAR, like NASCAR fans. Another conversation, but it's been really powerful to see that happen. So, goodness, I think like Lewis Hamilton, Danica Patrick with racing would be really cool. I love like Chef Charity Morgan and all the work that she's done with football. Oh my goodness. I mean, the list is like endless. James Wilkes, I'm a big fan of his. Oh man, I mean, my list is just endless of athletes. So if anyone's listening, like, yeah, that would be a dream.
Please let me know.
If you play a sport and you like cheese dip, hit me up.
Yeah, because I just think that that's a really cool angle. And in the society we live in, they're like the gladiators, right? They're the people that will pay $80 to see and then pay $20 for a beer to watch sweat.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so if you've got them eating the cheese dip and them aligning with, breaking down the biggest stereotype, I think, which is around a plant-based diet or a plant-based lifestyle, which is you're going to be weak.
Yep.
And so anyone who's listening to this, if you thought about plant-based, I would say first thing you should do is go watch Game Changers on Netflix, because that is a great way to get into it.
Oh, yeah.
And finally, if we're talking about your queso dip, if I did a blind taste test, I'll have a couple people over.
So much pressure.
It's a lot of pressure. I'll have a couple people over and we'll do a taste test. Obviously, we'll be COVID friendly. We'll do a taste test.
I love it.
Would we choose the LOCA as the better product?
Ooh, I hope so. So I do have some interesting, I think, data, but I'll caveat by saying with food, it's so subjective.
So subjective.
And
so
it's painful in some respects, because I've been going through this now that I've launched into e-commerce. I'm getting like real time feedback, and everything's being blasted to me at once, which is great, but it's overwhelming. And you sort of go into any business, and you have to know that not everything is not one thing is universally loved, I should say. Everyone's not going to love your product no matter what you do, and that's just by nature of it. And food is hard, and then you have a layer on top of that I'm trying to make a plant-based product on top of the fact that it's a dairy plant-based product. And vegan cheese already sort of has like this bad rap, and so there's sort of so many layers kind of working against the product, which is actually kind of part of the fun. And in my test market, so I was really fortunate to have Bon Appetit Management Group kind of take me under their wing. They're the ones that brought me into all of these places in my test market. And the chef at University of San Francisco, he's now become a friend, and he is just the best. We've stayed in touch through COVID. He brought in the product and loved it. And he wanted to do a test in that he wanted to just put the product next to the dairy queso in the cafeteria, not label it vegan. I think he'd said it was like a locally made product. I think he said plant-based. And if you want more information, ask kind of thing. Didn't really play up the fact that it was vegan. And kid you not, after a few weeks, the students were buying more of our sauce than they were the dairy. So they actually stopped making the dairy sauce in the house because students were buying more of it. And from their perspective, Bon Appetit in particular has a program. It's called 20% Farm to Fork, where they try to carve out a certain number of sales by sourcing from local vendors. And so for them, it was sort of a slam dunk in terms of hitting sustainability metrics, working with local, and the students were buying it. So that, I think, was like probably the best possible test of the product. And the story gets even more amusing. They brought me on campus to do like a vendor appreciation day. And I was demoing the product, and kid you not, I think the chef said, that's what we're serving upstairs in the cafeteria. That's what you've been eating for the last month. And like several students had this like kind of like visceral reaction, like, you're serving us vegan cheese up there? Like, I can't believe it. Sort of this like kind of almost a negative reaction, but they were enjoying the sauce up until they knew it was like a vegan cheese product. And so I think that was a really good learning that, yes, you're right. Plant-based is more palatable, better from a marketing standpoint. We have to get over this like mental barrier that vegan equals gross. vegan food can be delicious. Like, let's just name all the food that's inherently vegan. I love to use the example that vodka is vegan, beans are vegan, like all these delicious things that which I take that from this other group of people that started like coining this phrase. And I was like, that's genius. It's just a marketing thing. It's just a mental shift, and I think it's something that is our responsibility to help accelerate that. So that test market was a great kind of test to see like what people thought. And since the e-commerce launch, which was very recent, January 1st, so the data is, relatively small and fresh, but so far we've started to do some paid ads, and we're not targeting 100% vegans. We're targeting, I think, like 50-50 vegans. And then the other subset is like cheese lovers, people that, love Tostitos and all these kind of like processed cheese foods. And we're actually 50-50 with our sales, which is so exciting for me because and this is probably somewhat kind of controversial to say, but I think Pat Brown, the CEO of Impossible, he said a couple of years ago, I think he said, if we win over a vegan, that's wonderful because I'm vegan. But if we can win over a non-vegan, a flexitarian, then that, aligns directly with our mission. And I think that's just so cool. If I can get somebody, even if they eat it once a week, they swap out dairy a couple days a week, that's significant. That's great. That's a super positive thing in my book. Whether they're coming at the product because they have an allergy or they're reducing their cholesterol or whatever reason is welcome. And I'm excited about it. And I'm super, super happy.
So what you're saying is that there's a really good possibility when I do my at-home, is this better or is that better test, I'm very much likely going to choose the queso.
Did you grow up eating like Velveeta or Cheese Whiz or Tostitos?
No.
Okay.
I grew up in a New England household that didn't have any like savory. I don't really know how to I didn't grow up with snacks. They weren't in my house. My parents just said, no snacks.
That's amazing.
And New England food, right? Let's think about New England food. Clam chowder, right? It's kind of just like cream. There's nothing exciting about it. So I guess I'll extrapolate further that when I get to Memphis, everyone's like pouring hot sauce on things, and I go to the Rendezvous and they hold up an entire like piglet and they're like, let's eat it.
I forgot.
And I'm just
about
like,
that
oh my gosh. The Rendezvous was great. I still love the Rendezvous. I have very fond memories, but I think being from New England, I have a very bland palate, but I don't think anyone listening to this is like, oh, we don't want melted cheese on our nachos. Like that's savagery.
Well, I ask because I've noticed that your palate is shaped by the foods you ate growing up or the foods you're currently eating. If you've reduced your fast food consumption or processed foods, then foods that, if you do go get some fries at McDonald's, let's say, you might find that it's a little saltier than you remember, for example. If you've cut out your dairy or whatever you've cut out, your palate starts to change, over time. And so I've noticed that in certain cases, if you are currently eating Cheese Whiz and Velveeta, you taste my product and you think, oh, it's not too salty. In fact, I'm going to add a little bit more salt. Maybe I want to add a little non-dairy creamer in there on the skillet and really make it, super creamy and thick. And that's great. And then I've noticed that I have some people that I know that they grew up eating exclusively, vegan diets, and they find the product to be too salty, maybe too cheesy in flavor. In fact, I actually had this one family, so sweet. They tried the product. The parents loved it. They had this awesome response online. They were like, this is the best vegan cheese sauce we've ever had. They grew up eating a lot of processed dairy. We connected, online afterwards. And they said, it's funny though, because our son, we've raised him on a plant-based diet. He's only ever had vegan cheese and he thought your product was too cheesy. And so it's funny. I think the reactions are going to be very varied. I will say the mild flavor, it's very bold. It's intentionally very like cheddar, cheesy flavor, which cheddar is a pretty strong taste. It's salty, it's oily. I changed the formula because I really wanted to appeal to people that eat cheese sauce. So, I'll be curious to hear what you think. I'd love the feedback.
Yeah, I think growing up, just like most kids in the United States, who were born in the 80s and grew up in the 90s and 2000s, like we ate processed food.
I ate so much junk.
Yeah. I mean, there was whole foods obviously that were added in, and it was kind of like a combination of two. But definitely the thing I've noticed, and you probably notice, and probably the biggest feedback I get is when you stop eating processed food, you stop eating things with a lot of sugar, and then you go towards more of a plant-based diet, you taste the flavor levels so much deeper. Like I have an apple now, and it's like
wow.
Garden of Eden level, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think you can taste the flavor profile, the richness. It's not just the depth as much as it's a breadth.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm definitely excited to do this, but I'll keep that in mind.
Isn't that so beautiful?
It's the most beautiful.
Like you have like a new appreciation for
It's like you learned how to eat food again.
Yeah.
Like
You're absolutely right. I find that like I don't really salt my food as much as I used to. You're right. Like I enjoy fruit more. Things taste better, more intense, more powerful. Yeah, it's lovely.
Because when you think about it, for years, we were eating food that was engineered to make us essentially want more of it. Yes. And so because of that, it had all these added flavors. And so we'd forgotten just how good an apple can be. Yep. You've forgotten just how good, I'm trying to think of something else. Even when I think about meat, right? The best meat is meat that needs a little salt. You can think of Salt Bay, right? Dribbling the salt off his elbow there. It needs very little additions to be quality. But then in the United States, we take barbecue sauce, which is laden with sugars. We take all this other stuff. We make it a process. It's like, no, really good cuts of anything, whether it's meat or whether it's just fresh fruit, needs nothing. And if your palate can't taste that, you should probably engage with that a little bit as to why.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
With your products, tell me about all the offerings so people can start to be like, oh, am I going to go like drop, am I going to put all my Trump bucks or my Biden bucks into LOCA food?
Definitely plans to launch more products, in the future. And R&D is at the forefront of everything. It's number one priority. So, I sort of hope that I will get feedback and then continue to launch like new and improved versions of the formula. But right now there's two flavors. There's the mild nacho and the spicy jalapeno. The mild, as I mentioned, has a really bold, cheddary flavor with just really hints of subtle spice. And the jalapeno is very bright, very tangy, lots of just fresh jalapeno flavor. And we are using a ton of fresh produce. So the mild has just absurd amounts of fresh tomato, and the spicy has crazy amounts of fresh jalapeno. So it's interesting when you're talking about even palettes. I would kind of argue that same line of thinking could be applied to like visuals as well in food. One thing I've quickly noticed is the crowd that grew up eating like Velveeta. When you eat processed cheese, you go to a ballpark and you get cheese. You expect that sauce to be the same color every single time, the same exact texture, right? Because it's made with artificial flavors and colorings, and the process, it's going to be the same every time. But with our sauce, the color will slightly vary a little bit depending on the batch, because when you're using fresh produce, for example, like a tomato might be more deeper red or lighter in color, depending on where it was picked, what was happening with the weather at the time. There's all sorts of factors that will determine, the color of produce. So when that goes into the sauce, color varies slightly. And a couple of people, they've expressed that they don't like that. Like I got two milds, one is a little bit lighter in color. Does that mean something's wrong? So then it's an opportunity for me to educate them and say, well, we're using natural produce, and this is the result of using natural.
Is there any information on that on the website? I looked through the website thoroughly. I don't know if I saw something about the color.
I think I added something about the flavor notes. I don't know if I've added anything about the color, but I've been thinking about, I did. I added it last night.
Okay.
It's there.
Because that's really valuable. And I actually am wearing, just by happenstance, the shirt that I had a small t-shirt business a while ago called Imperador Clothing.
Yeah, I loved it.
And it was all clothing that was sourced from Cambodia, vis-a-vis Tonle, which is actually in San Francisco. And it was all the idea of basically, let's go find scraps in the garment district of the world, and we'll put together clothes and we'll sell clothes. Like we don't have to throw away 40% of waste for every t-shirt that the world creates.
That's crazy. Is that the stat?
Is that the what?
40%?
Yeah, it's like 40% of waste. Just when you think about, you have this sheet of garment and then you're going to cut out a pattern.
That
You're going to
makes
get all
sense.
of these strips
Wow.
that maybe you don't know what to do, but you can actually
Yeah.
do something with if you want to do, right?
Crazy.
And much of the feedback I got, because obviously in retail, it's about fit and feel. And beyond that, once the fit is great and the feel is great, then it's the how does it look? And if they see it online and it's a black and then they get it and it's almost like a dark gunmetal charcoal, it's still black from 10 yards, but up close, you're like, that was always the moment for me to educate, inform, and empower people to realize that they have a unique garment that was handmade and that we know the person who handmade it. Therefore, the value of it is exponentially more than if they had bought it at H&M or Zara.
Absolutely.
Or Forever 21. But I ran into that exact same thing. And I can't even imagine with how picky the overall world's market is with food, or I should say the US market. You can read articles about how we reject bananas because they were this size, but not this size, and apples because they had a deformation, because otherwise they'll be left on shelves. And I think the consumers, we all need to be a lot more open to the uniqueness in food, in our clothing, or whatever it is, because that's really where the value is. So it doesn't surprise me, I guess, that you had problems with color. Because if I'm picturing, okay, I'm going to order this ice cream and it's this ruby red, and I've been thinking about it and picturing it in my mind, because so much of food is like, we envision what we're going to eat. We order it on the menu and then we envision it. And then it comes and it's not a ruby red, but it's like a salmon. I'm going to be like, oh. So if there isn't any information behind it, that's going to empower me to be like, oh, this is because they made this out of, cashews or almonds, or I think you guys use potatoes primarily.
Yep, potatoes.
It may throw me for a loop.
I mean, this is kind of the power of like just real-time data and feedback in e-commerce. It's kind of the silver lining, I think, of this whole channel. It's like being able to understand that, because I would never have even thought put a note like that on my website before, because I'm used to buying like, the natural, like for example, peanut butter. You can buy natural peanut butter, and usually when it sits on the shelf, it's going to settle. And then the first inch is going to be oil, and the color is going to be a little bit varied, depending on which jar you pick up. I'm used to that. I'm not going to open that and be like, oh, why is there oil everywhere? I just understand that this is like part of it being natural. But if you're not used to buying that peanut butter and you just get it, you probably will think there's something wrong with the product. So it's like this opportunity, like you said, to educate consumers. And I think when people understand why it is that case, I think they'll appreciate it even more so. And they're like, oh, that's really cool. I now understand why this is a better option, and they understand it. But it does take kind of that extra educational moment.
Exactly. Because it's just kind of like an expectation. If I expect I go into this situation thinking X, Y, and Z, and it turns out to be A, B, and C may just be as good as X, Y, and Z, but my mind is already setting me up thinking for X, Y, and Z. And so when that doesn't happen, I forget that A, B, and C is comparable, if not even better.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
So if people want to get LOCA, I don't know if that's what your slogan is, but if you want to get LOCA, where can they go? I mean, I don't know, take it, right?
Let's do it.
If you want to get LOCA, where can they find you? And shout out the website, shout out your social. If they want to get in touch with you personally, I would assume that's through Instagram, but go ahead, take this moment to let people know where they can find the products.
So right now the product is only available on our website. It's www.eatlocafood.com. And you can order from a 2-pack or a 4-pack, get it shipped direct to your door. Our Instagram is @eatlocafood as well. And you can email me, lauren@eatlocafood.com. Love direct emails. In fact, I try to write directly back to customers if they reach out. Love building that relationship. So reach out anytime.
Thank you for hopping on, and I loved hearing about LOCA, and this will be exciting to do a LOCA taste test.
Amazing. That sounds great. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. This has been a blast.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Wi-Fi and Water, and be sure to check out Lauren's Queso at eatlocafood.com, where if you use the discount code WIFIANDQUESO, Wi-Fi and Queso, you'll receive a 20% discount when you check out. As always, be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wi-Fi and Water Podcast. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.